Welcome. Settle yourself into a place of comfort. Let your body grow heavy and allow your breathing to slow. Tonight, we will take a long, unhurried journey into the American West, the place so often romanticized in stories of cowboys, pioneers, and wide-open frontiers. But beneath the golden glow of sunsets and the quiet whisper of prairie winds lay a world that was unforgiving, uncertain, and profoundly difficult to endure. The Wild West, stretching across the latter half of the 19th century, was not the land of cinematic heroes and endless opportunity that many imagine. It was a place of harsh climates, fragile settlements, frequent illness, and an ever-present sense of danger, not only from conflict, but from hunger, thirst, and sheer exhaustion. This is not a story of quick duels or daring escapes, but rather of quiet endurance, daily struggles, and the endless rhythm of survival. Tonight, you will drift with me through those lives, imagining yourself there, not in a whirlwind of action, but in the slow, steady pulse of reality. So close your eyes if you wish, picture the open plains before you, and let us begin. Imagine waking in the early dawn of a western homestead. The walls around you are not solid plaster or brick, but thin wooden planks, roughly hewn and uneven. Through the cracks, a cool draft slips in, carrying with it the faint, dusty scent of earth and livestock. The floor beneath your bedding is hard, often little more than packed dirt, covered with a worn rug or straw mat. You are not rising from a soft mattress, but from a thin cot stuffed with corn husks or wool clippings. The blanket above you is coarse and heavy, never quite warm enough to hold back the chill of the night. The sound that greets you is not silence. Outside, a restless horse shifts in its stall, hooves scraping against wood. Chickens stir, scratching and clucking faintly, waiting for feed. And above all of this is the deep stillness of the prairie, vast and endless, stretching toward a horizon that feels impossibly far away. There is no time to linger. A frontier morning demanded action. Fires needed to be stoked, sometimes coaxed back to life from faint embers that glowed weakly after the night. Water had to be fetched, often from a well or stream not at all close to the house. The bucket, heavy and unwieldy, would slosh against your legs on the long walk back. Breakfast was rarely a lavish spread. It was usually simple cornbread from the day before. Perhaps a bit of bacon if the family was fortunate, or beans stewed with whatever salt could be spared. The taste was plain, sometimes bland, but filling enough to sustain hours of labor. Coffee, when available, was treasured, though often it was weak, stretched thin, or even made from roasted grains when supplies ran low. Clothing was not chosen for style, but survival. The garments were stiff and often patched, smelling faintly of smoke from the hearth. Shirts were rough against the skin, boots were heavy and stiff, and hats were pulled low to shield against the relentless sun that would soon rise. And then the work began. Perhaps you were tending to livestock, trudging through mud or dust to feed animals before seeing to your own needs. Or perhaps you were preparing for a day in the fields, hands already raw from handling tools. Life revolved around labor, and there was no escaping it. Every hour of daylight was precious. Every task tied directly to whether or not your family would make it through the season. Even children bore this weight. From an early age, boys and girls alike fetched water, gathered firewood, and tended to animals. Leisure, as we understand it, was nearly absent. The rhythm of life was unyielding, structured not by clocks or convenience, but by necessity. Now, as you picture this morning, you might feel the weight of it, the cold floor, the stiff clothes, the emptiness of the land around you. In such a place, survival was not guaranteed. Each day brought new uncertainties, new tests of endurance. And yet, to those who lived it, this was simply life. The rhythm of their days was shaped not by comfort, but by endurance. Imagine now, not yourself, but another life. One that unfolded in the endless expanse of the American West. Let us follow the quiet, steady rhythm of a man named Elijah Harper, a farmer who left Missouri in the 1870s to try his fortune in the wide prairie lands of Kansas. Elijah was not famous. He was not a gunslinger or a lawman, not a figure of song or story. He was, instead, one of countless settlers who came seeking a better life, only to find that the West gave nothing freely. He and his wife, Sarah, traveled by wagon with little more than a pair of oxen, a few tools, and what savings they had managed to gather. The journey was long, the ruts in the road filled with mud in the spring rains and baked hard as stone in the summer heat. The wagon creaked endlessly, wheels wobbling over uneven ground. Nights were spent under thin canvas, listening to the distant cries of coyotes and the groaning winds across the plains. When they reached the place that would become their homestead, there was almost nothing. No buildings, no fences, no wells, only open land, stretching into a horizon so vast it seemed to swallow the sky itself. The promise of the Homestead Act gave them 160 acres to call their own. But the government's gift was only land, and the land itself was often merciless. Elijah's first task was shelter. He built what was called a sod house, cutting thick bricks of prairie earth, heavy with roots, and stacking them into crude walls. The roof was made from wooden beams covered with grass and soil. When it rained, water trickled through in fine lines, dampening the floor. When the sun blazed down, the walls held heat like an oven. The air inside was thick, carrying the scent of damp earth mixed with smoke from the fire that never seemed to burn cleanly. Sarah made do with what little they had, stewing beans, grinding corn, sewing clothes from flour sacks when fabric was scarce. She tended a small patch of vegetables, but droughts came often, the soil drying and cracking until plants withered in the relentless sun. And then there was winter. The wind on the plains was sharp, relentless, cutting through the gaps in the sod walls and stinging any skin left uncovered. Snow drifted high against the doorway, sometimes so heavy that Elijah had to dig them out with the shovel just to reach the livestock. They burned cow dung when firewood ran short, the smoke acrid but necessary. Insects came with the seasons, too. Grasshoppers would sometimes descend in thick swarms, their wings humming like a low storm. They devoured crops in hours, stripping fields bare and leaving settlers like Elijah staring at the ruin of a year's labor. It was a life of constant endurance. And though Elijah worked endlessly, though Sarah endured long hours of silence and isolation, the West was rarely forgiving. Many settlers gave up, returning east in defeat. Others simply vanished into the land, their names forgotten. Elijah, though, remained. He endured season after season, not because life was easy, but because leaving would mean admitting that all the struggle had been for nothing. Now, as you imagine his life, picture the sagging roof of a sod house, the smoky air, the endless horizon. Picture the quiet strength of a man who asked little of the world, and the quiet endurance of a woman who made life bearable in a place that resisted comfort. This was the reality of the Wild West. Not shootouts or heroic adventure, but the slow test of human resilience. And it is in this rhythm of hardship, more than anything, that survival proved elusive for so many. The West was not only a place of dust and toil, of wagons and cattle, it was also a landscape of mystery, a land that stirred the imagination, filling the empty spaces with stories. When the nights stretched endlessly and silence pressed against the walls of a small cabin, people often reached for belief, for superstition, for tales to explain what could not be seen. Imagine yourself sitting beside a faint fire, its light flickering against rough-hewn walls. The outside world is black, vast, and unbroken. There are no city lamps, no hum of distant traffic, only the wind, moaning low through the prairie grass. In such moments, it was easy to believe that something unseen was moving in the dark. Native peoples of the land had long told stories of spirits tied to rivers, rocks, and mountains. The Lakota spoke of the Untehi water spirits said to dwell in the depths, stirring storms and floods. The Navajo spoke of skinwalkers, shadowy figures that could take the form of animals, moving silently beneath the moonlight. These were not stories told for amusement, but warnings, reminders that the natural world was alive with forces beyond human control. Settlers brought their own beliefs, too many carried from Europe. Stories of witches and wandering spirits slipped into the frontier, blending with older indigenous traditions. Some believed owls carried omens, their cries foretelling death. Others whispered about ghost lights on the plains, small glowing orbs that appeared in the distance, perhaps marsh gases, or perhaps something more unearthly. Outlaws and violent deaths gave rise to ghost tales as well. In dusty towns, saloons where gunmen had fallen were said to remain haunted. A chair that rocked by itself, a creak of floorboards in an empty room. A figure glimpsed in the corner of the ice-ash moments kept belief alive. For men and women who faced daily hardship, the thought that the dead might linger close was both terrifying and strangely comforting. And then there were the unexplained sounds of the wilderness itself. Winds that howled like voices, coyotes whose calls overlapped in eerie harmony, creating what some swore were human cries. The creak of a tree in the distance could sound like a door opening. The earth was alive, always shifting, always murmuring. The mystery of the West lay not only in fear, but in the unknown. What lay beyond the next horizon? What ruins hid beneath the soil? Travelers sometimes came across stone circles, abandoned pueblos or ancient carvings etched into canyon walls. These remnants of earlier civilizations, ancestral pueblos, Mississippian mound builders, desert tribes, long vanished, were often met with wonder and unease. Settlers rarely understood them, so they wrapped them in stories, whispers of lost cities, hidden treasure, or curses left behind. Folklore was survival of another kind. It gave meaning to a world that seemed too large, too empty, too harsh. When lightning cracked across the prairie sky, or when the sun sank behind distant ridges, leaving only the endless dark, these stories provided comfort. They were reminders that humans had not been the first to walk this land, nor would they be the last. And as you rest in the quiet rhythm of these tales, notice how the line between history and mystery blurs. The West was both real and imagined. Its dangers physical, but its silence filled with shadows that no one could quite explain. When you picture the Wild West, it is easy to imagine a rough, equally dusty cowboys drinking side by side, outlaws mingling with settlers, everyone bound by the same struggles, under the vast, empty sky. But in truth, the West, like every society, had its layers, its deep divides between those with influence and those without. Imagine first the ordinary settler, a man or woman working the land, waking each dawn to a day of unending labor. The cabin might be little more than one room, its floor packed dirt, its roof patched with sod. A meal of cornbread, beans, and salt pork was common, repeated day after day. Comforts were few, and survival depended on weather, on luck, and on the strength of one's own back. Children grew quickly into laborers, helping to haul water, herd animals, or tend the garden that fed the family. Now, contrast this with the lives of those who held power in the frontier towns. There were wealthy ranchers, men who owned not just a few cattle, but herds stretching across thousands of acres. Their homes were larger, sometimes built of stone or fine timber, furnished with rugs, glass windows, and even imported goods carried by train from the east. At their tables, meals were varied and abundant. Beef roasted slowly, vegetables preserved in glass jars, pies cooled by open windows. In the growing towns, merchants and bankers held influence too. The owner of a general store might live above his shop. Shelves lined with goods travelers desperately needed: flour, tools, fabric, and medicine. Such men often extended credit, and in doing so gained a kind of quiet control over the lives of poorer settlers. There were also the lawmen and officials, some noble, others corrupt. A sheriff might stride through town with a polished star upon his chest, respected and feared in equal measure. Yet, in other places, that same badge could be bent to the will of wealthy interests, used less to protect than to enforce control. And then, higher still, were those whose wealth seemed untouchable. Railroad magnates, investors, and mine owners who rarely dirtied their boots with the dust of the land. From offices in Denver or San Francisco, they reaped fortunes from the labor of nameless men who toiled in dangerous shafts or blistering sun. The divide was vast. For one, champagne and imported cigars. For the other, blackened lungs and an early grave. Think of the saloon, a place where these worlds briefly intersected. At one table, a ranch hand with coins jingling faintly in his pocket, ordering a single shot of whiskey he might nurse for an hour. At another, a cattle baron buying rounds for his companions, laughing loud above the piano's weary notes. The same air, the same smoke, the same floorboards, sticky with spilled drink, yet the experience utterly different, shaped by wealth and station. Women, too, felt these divides. For many, life meant endless work. Scrubbing clothes in cold water, mending garments by lamplight, raising children in a place where illness could strike at any moment. But for a smaller, wealthier few, the wives of mine owners or railroad men, life could mean finer dresses, education for their children, and the occasional social gathering in parlors lit with kerosene lamps. Social contrast was not only about wealth, but about belonging. Immigrants, Chinese railroad workers, Irish laborers, Mexican vaqueros often lived on the margins. Their food, language, and traditions set them apart, sometimes respected, often resented. Many laws and practices excluded them from the full promise of the West. Their labor was welcome, their presence less so. The gap between these worlds was not always visible at first glance. On a dusty street, both the poor laborer and the prosperous merchant might appear worn by the same sun, wrapped in the same dust. But step inside their homes, sit at their tables, listen to the worries whispered late at night, and the distance was unmistakable. For you, dropped suddenly into this world, survival would depend in part on which side of this divide you found yourself. As a poor homesteader, you would strain against the earth itself. Your days a cycle of toil, your nights filled with worry. As a wealthy rancher or merchant, you might live more comfortably, but you would be just as vulnerable to sudden violence, to economic collapse, to the lawlessness of a land still shaping itself. And so the West was not a place of simple equality, but a landscape of contrasts where a few held much, most held little, and everyone, no matter their station, lived in the long shadow of uncertainty. The silent struggles of survival. When you imagine the Wild West, it is easy to focus on the drama of shootouts, bar brawls, or wagon trains rolling across the plains. Yet the truth is, life was rarely so theatrical. It was slow, exhausting, and often monotonous, broken only by hardships that pressed in like an unrelenting tide. Picture the morning again, the same pale dawn breaking over the land. For a settler, the day began not with choice, but with necessity. Every chore had its own rhythm, and to leave one undone could mean hunger, illness, or worse. Fetching water was one of the most basic, and yet one of the most laborious. Wells were often shallow or scarce. Sometimes water had to be carried in buckets from a stream, a half-mile or more from the home. Each bucket heavy, each step deliberate, the handle biting into the hands. Food was another daily concern. The family garden, if it grew well, could provide corn, beans, or squash. But crops depended on weather, and weather in the West was a merciless master. One season, rains might come in torrents, flooding fields and drowning seedlings. Another, the skies might remain empty for weeks, the ground cracked and useless. A single hailstorm, lasting just minutes, could destroy months of labor. Imagine watching your only hope of food pounded into the dirt by ice falling from a dark sky. Illness was another constant shadow. There were few doctors and fewer medicines. A simple fever could become life-threatening. Wounds, even small ones, could fester. For children, diseases like measles or diphtheria swept through communities with terrible swiftness. Families often relied on home remedies, herbs steeped in boiling water, or poultices applied by hand. Sometimes they worked, sometimes they did not. The uncertainty lingered in every household, a quiet fear that even the strongest could be undone by the smallest misfortune. The labor itself wore down the body. Men walked behind plows, pulled by oxen or horses, breaking ground that was heavy and unyielding. Women bent over washboards, scrubbing clothes in cold water until their fingers cracked. Children gathered wood for cooking, their arms aching from carrying bundles back to the cabin. Each task was repeated daily, the rhythm unending. Unlike in today's world, there was little rest and almost no leisure. Even shelter itself was fragile. A cabin might be built with care, its logs stacked neatly, its roof sealed with clay. But storms ripped shingles loose, snow drifted through cracks, and summer heat turned the air inside stifling. Fires were both a necessity and a danger. The same flames that warmed a room or cooked a meal could, in a moment of carelessness, consume the entire structure, leaving only ashes. Then there were the dangers beyond human control. Rattlesnakes coiled unseen in tall grass, wolves prowling the edges of campfires, and locust swarms that could devour fields in hours. Each season carried its own threats, each day its own quiet tests. Isolation, too, was its own hardship. Many homesteads stood miles from their nearest neighbors. A journey to town could take hours, sometimes days. Letters from loved ones in the east traveled slowly, weeks or months to arrive, if at all. Loneliness settled heavily, especially in long winters when snow sealed doors and silenced the outside world. And then there was money, or more often, the lack of it. Many settlers lived in debt, owing to merchants, to railroads, or to the very land they tried to tame. A poor harvest meant falling behind. A missed payment meant losing everything. The economy of the West was fragile, tied to the boom and bust of cattle prices, the yield of a mine, or the success of a railroad line. A life's work could vanish with the shifting of numbers written in a distant ledger. For you, placed into this world, the endless weight of these struggles would soon press down. It would not be one dramatic event that undid you, but the slow accumulation of small, daily hardships. A blister that turned to infection. A week of meals too meager to provide strength. A cold that settled in your lungs with no medicine to cure it. Survival was not only about courage, it was about endurance. And endurance in the Wild West was tested every single day. The drama of gunfights and gold strikes might capture imaginations now, but it was these small, unglamorous battles, the labor, the hunger, the illnesses, the isolation that determined who survived and who did not. Myths, mysteries, and the hidden culture of the Wild West. The Wild West was never just a place. It was also a story, one told, retold, and reshaped, until it became larger than life. For those who lived in it, the West was full of uncertainty. For those who came later, it became a canvas for myth and legend. And even now, as you listen, you may sense that much of what people believe about that time is not entirely real. Imagine the small settlements, half-built towns on the edge of nowhere. The streets were dusty, the buildings rough, yet stories clung to them like morning mist. A gunfight that lasted seconds might be spoken of for years. A stranger passing through could become a figure of rumor. A gambler, perhaps, or a drifter, or someone fleeing a past no one dared to ask about. In the absence of newspapers or records, word of mouth carried more power than fact. Tales spread about men who could draw a pistol faster than the blink of an eye. About outlaws who robbed trains and disappeared into the desert, leaving no trace but their names. Jesse James, Billy the Kid, Butch Cassidy. These were men of flesh and blood, yet their stories were told in whispers that blurred truth with invention. To the lonely settler, their exploits seemed distant, almost dreamlike, but not all mysteries were born of outlaws. The land itself carried its own secrets. Across the plains and mountains were ancient traces, petroglyphs carved into stone, burial mounds hidden beneath grass, pottery shards unearthed by plow blades. These belonged to the peoples who had lived in the West for thousands of years before settlers arrived. For those who stumbled upon them, they were silent echoes of another world, reminders that the land had its own deep memory, older than any cabin or cattle trail. Superstition ran deep as well. In isolated cabins, by dim lantern light, families told stories to pass long evenings. Some spoke of ghostly riders seen on moonlit nights, their horses silent, their forms vanishing into mist. Others whispered of cursed gold mines, where men disappeared after striking rich veins of ore, as though the earth itself guarded its treasures jealously. Whether one believed or not, such tales gave shape to the unseen forces that seemed to rule life in the West. Even ordinary places took on a kind of mystery. The desert at night stretched vast and silent, the sky above so thick with stars that it seemed endless. Coyotes howled in the distance, their voices rising and falling like something unearthly. Travelers often described the experience as otherworldly, as though the land itself was alive, watching, keeping its secrets. And then there was the culture of the West, a mixture of countless influences: native traditions, Spanish architecture, African American communities, Chinese immigrants who laid tracks for the railroads, European settlers who carried with them songs and recipes and ways of life. Around a single frontier town, you might hear a Spanish lullaby sung to a child, the ring of a blacksmith's hammer, the call of a street vendor in a language unfamiliar to most passers-by. It was a place where many worlds collided, leaving behind layers of culture, sometimes blending, sometimes clashing. For the individual, though, the mystery was often more personal. Who could you trust in a land where law was thin, where men and women carried pasts they seldom revealed? A neighbor might offer help one day and turn against you the next. A drifter might share your campfire, telling stories, and vanish by dawn, leaving only unanswered questions. In this atmosphere of uncertainty, silence carried weight, and glances could mean more than words. In time, the Wild West was romanticized, transformed into novels, dime stories, and traveling shows. Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show brought riders, sharpshooters, and native performers to audiences in the East and even in Europe. Yet what they displayed was not the hard, weary truth of daily survival. It was a performance, a myth polished for entertainment. While settlers labored and suffered in obscurity, audiences elsewhere dreamed of duels at high noon and the thrill of adventure. The truth was quieter, less glamorous, but perhaps more haunting. The real mysteries of the West were not in gunfights or gold strikes, but in the lives lived and lost in silence, in the forgotten graveyards on windswept hills, in the cabins left empty, their walls collapsing back into the earth, in the marks left on stone by hands that had shaped the land long before the newcomers came. And if you were to step into that time, you would feel it too. The sense that the West was not fully knowable, that beneath its harsh sunlight and endless horizons lay something just out of reach. A mystery you could not solve, a silence you could not break. The Wild West is often remembered as a place of equality, where all stood on the same ground beneath the wide sky. Yet the truth was more complicated. Just as today, there were those who lived in comfort, and those who struggled from dawn to dusk. The frontier may have seemed rough and lawless, but wealth and influence still carved out divisions that could not be ignored. Imagine, for a moment, the main street of a growing town. At one end stood a grand hotel, its facade painted brightly, its windows reflecting the sun. Inside, wealthy cattle barons, railroad men, and visiting politicians dined on fine meals, beefsteaks, fresh bread, perhaps even wine imported from far away. They spoke in low voices, discussing profits, rail contracts, and land rights. To them, the West was not hardship, but opportunity. A place where fortunes could be made on herds of cattle, on tracks of iron, on veins of silver pulled from the earth. Yet, just beyond the hotel's polished doors, another world existed. Outside, in the same dusty street, cowhands sat on the steps of a saloon. Their boots worn, their pay uncertain, their future precarious. Many were young men, some barely out of their teens, who worked long days for wages that often vanished into gambling tables or whiskey glasses. They had no rooms at the hotel. Instead, they slept in bunks shared with others or under the stars, with only a blanket for warmth. This contrast could be felt in every corner of the West. In mining camps, the wealthy investors might never set foot underground. Yet they collected the profits, while miners risked their lungs and their lives in shafts filled with dust and silence. In cattle towns, ranch owners might live in comfortable houses on the edge of town, while drovers, the men who pushed herds across endless miles, endured blistering sun, biting winds, and nights of uneasy sleep. Women, too, lived these contrasts. The wives of wealthy men might dress in silks brought from the East, entertain guests with music played on a piano, and read books by lamplight. Meanwhile, frontier women in homesteads spent their days over wash basins, cooking over open flames, patching clothes until the fabric could take no more stitches. Their work was endless, their comforts few, their lives measured in cycles of labor and waiting. And then there were the powerful institutions. The railroads, for instance, stretched across the West, reshaping the land itself. Those who held shares in the companies grew richer with every mile of track laid. Yet the Chinese laborers who hammered those rails, mile after mile, were paid little and lived in temporary camps, often facing hostility from the very towns they helped connect. In the political sphere, governors, judges, and military officers often lived in relative ease. They attended dinners, received visitors, and issued orders. But far from their homes, settlers and native families alike bore the weight of those decisions. Policies made in distant offices shaped who kept their land and who lost it, who thrived and who suffered. And then there was the contrast of silence itself. The powerful had voices that carried words printed in newspapers, names etched in records. But the ordinary, the miners, the drovers, the washerwomen, the laborers, their words often disappeared with the wind. They left behind few letters, few journals, and their stories are harder to hear. Yet it was they who built the West, plank by plank, trail by trail, their lives forming the quiet foundation upon which others stood. Even within the towns, these contrasts were visible in simple details. On one side of the street, a general store might sell fine fabrics and imported goods for those who could afford them. On the other side, families stretched their coins to buy flour, beans, and coffee, just enough to last another week. A wealthy household might own a clock, its ticking steady, its brass polished. A poorer family measured time by the rising sun and the setting stars. And yet, despite these contrasts, there was an uneasy closeness. The wealthy cattleman relied on the cowboy to drive his herds. The mine owner needed the miner's labor. The governor's orders meant little without the settlers and soldiers who carried them out. Lives of comfort and lives of hardship were bound together, inseparable, each dependent on the other, though the benefits were never shared equally. To walk through such a world was to see these divisions constantly. A pair of polished boots passing beside worn, dusty ones, a carriage rolling past a wagon, a family eating from porcelain plates, while another scraped stew from a single iron pot. The West, in truth, was never one story, but many, woven together, layered, contrasting, each carrying its own rhythm, its own struggle, its own silence. And if you were to step into that time, you would feel it. The distance between those with power and those without, a distance not measured in miles, but in comfort, in opportunity, in survival itself. A reminder that the Wild West, like every place and every age, was shaped not just by the land, but by the inequalities of human life. The West, a place of endless skies, where the horizon stretched farther than the eye could see. It was a land of promise, but also of cost. For every dream that bloomed, another withered. For every fortune made, countless lives endured hardship, silence, and toil. If you were to step into that world, truly step into it, you would find yourself weighed down almost immediately. The heat, the dust, the aching miles on foot or horseback, the gnawing hunger when food was scarce, the anxiety of whether that could shift from gentle sun to storms of dust or snow. Survival itself was a constant calculation, every day a test of resilience. And yet, it was not only the land that tested you, it was society. Laws were often uncertain, justice uneven, and violence a reality you could not ignore. A simple argument could end in blood. A wrong glance could spark trouble. In some towns, the sheriff's star carried authority. In others, it was little more than a piece of tin. The idea of freedom, so closely tied to the West, was always shadowed by danger. But within these struggles lay the myths we still carry. The cowboy riding alone into the setting sun. The outlaw living fast, dying young, his name whispered in saloons. The gold miner striking it rich with a single shining nugget. These images, romantic and enduring, are only fragments of a much larger truth. For behind them were countless men and women who never found gold, who never escaped poverty, whose names are not remembered. It is here, in this gap between myth and reality, that the real West exists. A place where survival meant long hours, calloused hands, weary nights, and quiet endurance. To live there was not to chase glory, but to persist, one day to the next, through dust, heat, and uncertainty. And as the years passed, the West itself began to change. Railroads stretched farther, binding distant places together. Telegraph wires carried voices across miles. Towns became cities. What had once felt boundless grew smaller, mapped and measured, divided and claimed. The so-called frontier closed, but its echoes remained. In the stories told, in the monuments built, in the myths carried forward like embers. Imagine now standing at the edge of that world, watching it fade. The last herds driven, the last camps abandoned, the last great wilderness crossed by rail. For the people who lived then, it was not a myth, but a memory. For us, it is a story, softened by distance, reshaped by time. And so, as you lie here tonight, letting these stories drift around you, remember this: the West was not a place of easy survival. It was a place of contrast, beauty and brutality, silence and noise, wealth and struggle. To live there was to endure. To survive there was to bend without breaking. To hope even when the land itself resisted you. The myths are golden, but the reality was dust. And if you were to walk into that time, to live in that world, you would feel it deeply. The weight of survival pressing upon you. Now let that weight dissolve. Let the voices of the past grow softer, until they are only whispers carried by the wind. Let the dust settle, the sun fade, and the silence of night surround you. Breathe slowly. Let the frontier recede. The world is quiet again, and in that quiet, sleep waits.